Okay, we're going to get started, folks. So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cindy Lindsay, and I'm your host for today's webinar. I'm also the Director of Learning and Network Engagement for Community Foundations of Canada. I hope you are keeping well these days and managing to enjoy some of the sunshine and great weather we've been having as we move through these days. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us today for our webinar on Feminist Grantmaking, the Power of Purpose. This is the second of a two-part series, the first being a dive into understanding intersectionality as it relates to our work and as community foundations and as individuals. Both of these webinar recordings will be available in the CFC resource library if you'd like to refer to them at another time or share them with your fellow staff or board members. Before we get started, I just want to share with you a couple of housekeeping rules. So if you haven't participated in one of our webinars beforehand, we have everyone muted. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. But take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box and tell us where you're from. As I mentioned, the webinar recording will be available in the CFC resource library. And for the best webinar experience, please close all your other applications and turn up your volume so you can hear our speakers. And as we explore today's topics, please share any thoughts, insights, questions, or responses that you might have in the chat box. That will be our best way to communicate with our presenters if you want to seek any clarification with them. And we're also, if time allows, we're going to go into breakout rooms partway through. And so please know that we'll stop sharing the screen and moving into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes and then coming back in, because we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So at this point, I am thrilled that we're bringing to you today an amazing lineup of speakers and thought leaders. I will let them introduce themselves, but we will, I'll let them start with Andrea. We'll move from right to left. And so Andrea, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I will be very quick because I think I know most of you. We've been on many webinars over the last few weeks, the last few years, in fact. I'm Andrea Dix. I am part of the team at Community Foundations of Canada. I am here in my home in Ottawa. It is a lovely day here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'm just delighted to be in conversation with all of you, and in particularly delighted to be speaking alongside Wariri, Juniper, and Mai. So Mai, over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. I'd like to acknowledge that I am on unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. My name is Mai. I am a gender consultant with CFC, and I thank Andrea and Cindy for inviting me in as an outsider into your space. I've done a lot of gender and GBA plus, gender-based analysis plus work with different organizations. So anything ranging from federal government to private sector to other organizations like the Ottawa Police Service. So I'm really happy to be joining you today, and I really hope that you enjoy our topic on feminist grant making. Over to you, Juniper.
Hi, everybody. So I am here in what is called Montreal, which is unceded Indigenous territory as well, traditionally stewarded by the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, the Atganastake. And my parcours, my path has been many strands interweaving, but gender equity has always been at the core since I was a teenager of what was most important to me. And today I do a lot of different things. I wear many hats, but a lot of my work as a consultant, as a researcher, is working with grant makers, as well as with the other side of philanthropy, so fundraising, and trying to see how we can use those institutions, those tools to advance social justice.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I am new to most of you. My name is Wariri Muhungi. I'm the Global Programs Manager at the Equality Fund, where I lead managing our grant making aspects of our global calls for proposals, our grantee selection processes, as well as our feminist learning monitor and evaluation systems. I've been working at the intersections of human rights philanthropy and feminist women's rights organizations for about 50 years now, both in Canada and globally, and mostly with girl, youth, young women, and LGBT-led organizations. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here this afternoon to have this critical conversation on feminist grant making. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, and really appreciate that you could join us today. Andrea, I'm going to start with you to set the context for today's discussion.
Sure. Thanks so much, Cindy. You know, Mai and Wariri and Juniper asked that I would just share a little bit about why this conversation, why now? And I think that a conversation about feminist approaches to grant making has been something that has been evolving through our work in community foundations at CFC over the last number of years. I think it really, for me, starts when we began talking about sustainable development goals, when the calls for action came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when the calls for justice were released about a year ago, connected to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry that happened here in Canada. And so all of those elements were in our midst. And at the same moment, we had this wonderful opportunity to be part of a coalition of partners to really lean into the development of what is now the Equality And through this work, through our own learning experiences, a lot which came from community foundations. I know we have several of you on the call who have been leaning into feminist approaches to grant making over the last number of years. So all of this came to a space in which CFC and community foundations have been invited on what is a 5-year journey, but which I'm hopeful will be much longer, with some domestic work around gender equality. And so that's how we've gotten to know Mai, and Juniper has been part of the space for a number of years. And for me, I really think about it in terms of the values of community foundations, of the values of CFC. And I think that the feminist approaches to grant making are this amazing way in which we are practicing with intention the values in which we speak about. And so it's a moment where we are aligning our actions with our values to really lean into, intentionally doing things differently. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And that's where I see a lot of us leaning in the space of our COVID-19 relief efforts, in the ways in which we are engaging in dialogue and action around the systemic racism that is being spotlighted across our country and other countries all around the world. And so I think that this conversation is actually arriving in a perfect moment. It's arriving because of a history of leaning into gender equality work, but it's also well situated for the broader work that we are doing at community foundations, in particular in this moment. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Andrea. We're going to get into a really interesting discussion with our subject matter experts, Wariri and Juniper. And I like that Andrea set the context. For a few months now, we've kind of been putting off this webinar thinking, okay, COVID-19, people are in emergency response mode. How does feminist grant making really play a role right now during COVID-19? During COVID-19, feminist grant making plays an important role, even now more than ever. The crisis is threatening feminist organizations and movements, and there's an urgent need to really support funding to organizations that work with those who are marginalized. It's these organizations that are most at risk of losing their funding today. And it's because budgets are getting rerouted to support health systems and economic programs, which is fine, but also these programs are also not always taking into account non-mainstream movements. And so there's a growing concern for women, girls, and non-binary people. For women, we're working more from home. It's often made more difficult depending on increased caring responsibilities, whether it's for elders or for children, housing issues, access to internet, domestic violence, and we can think of many other topics that really kind of intersect with this. The access to reproductive and sexual healthcare services are made even more difficult during physical distancing measures. And according to the New York Times, 1 in 3 women are frontline workers, so still carrying the burden to feed their families while going out to work. The Deputy Director of the UN Women, Anita Bashia, she declared that during this crisis, women's organizations are facing an extinction of funding and danger of closures. Feminist grant making has the power, when we put intention towards it, to really grant funds to organizations or groups who are kind of at the margins and made invisible. So getting that support to these groups is really what's needed. It's important to shift power and build relationships of trust across unequal power positions that can be inherent in funder-grantee relationships. And it also, feminist grantmaking also takes into account gender inequalities, looks at creative, innovative, flexible ways to provide core financial support. So we're going to be exploring these questions in the next 20 minutes or so. How can we be more flexible when it comes to funding feminist work? How do we ensure that we're listening to what people are really saying? And how do we ensure that we're actually tracking and reporting these initiatives to demonstrate that the needs of women, girls, and non-binary people are met? So hopefully together in this webinar, we'll be able to look at ways of breaking traditional ways of funding so that we can actually uplift more of those vulnerable groups. So we'll go to our next slide. And that brings us to the learning objectives. And I'm hoping that, you know, we've got an hour together, so it's very short. But I hope that with this rich conversation that by the end, you'll actually have an understanding of the principles of feminist grant making. And then to really gain a little bit of knowledge, I won't go in depth, but a little bit on the surface of some of the tools and resources available to support you in your feminist grant making journeys. So as we go into the next slide, I'm going to ask you the question, and I'd like for you to put it into your chat box. What's one thing that you hope to get out of today's webinar on feminist grant making? So what is one thing that you hope to get out of today's webinar on feminist grant making? Last week, we talked about intersectionality. So for those of you who are at that webinar, we explored the Black feminist lens that asks the question, which groups are being left behind and why? In feminist grant making, we're going to continue to build on the concept of intersectionality, and we're going to actually see how grants can be used to provide to be provided so that we can fund feminist movements and work so that the most vulnerable are actually reached. So next slide. So I've got a panel of experts here, and you know, we want to try to make this as interactive as possible. And I'm just seeing a little bit of the chat going on here. So Joanne in Saskatoon says she wants to find ways to identify and remove barriers. This is a great question. So we've got I have a few questions for our subject matter experts, but we'll come back to what people are actually saying in the chat as well. Julie says, to gain a sense of leaders in this field in our community foundation movement. It's great. And then from Stacy, a better understanding of the current trends in feminist grant making and where the greatest needs currently are. So Wariri and Juniper, I'm hoping that maybe we can actually delve into some of these conversations. But let's get into our very first question about what is feminist grant making? Are there principles to it? So we'll kind of get into the foundational concepts. I'm going to open it up to both Wariri or Juniper. If anyone wants to go first.
Sure, thanks for that and that amazing context, Mai. So, you know, with understanding that feminist grant making really also depends on how you position yourself and your ideas on feminisms. As a global feminist fund, we understand that there's multiple feminisms with an S, that there's indigenous feminisms, that there's Black feminisms that we might point it to, and that this really influences one's political positioning and social location, and thus influences their grant making. At the Equality Fund, we have a few elements. One that is just crystal clear is that we're supporting self-determination.
Oh, did we lose Wariri?
Yeah, I think we lost her message in there. I'll just get in touch with her.
Just when she was getting into the meat of it.
I
So
can
while
do
we
my
wait,
best to pick up.
sure. While we wait for
Wariri
Juniper, do you want to pick up on that question? What is feminist grant making, and then we can, if you have any ideas with the principles too, we can get into that.
So she was talking about self-determination, and so that means that we look for supporting groups that have leadership, who have lived experience or who are very, very close to the beneficiaries, right? So feminist grant making is trying to shift power, and in philanthropy, it's often quite unbalanced, as you all know, that the folks with the resources tend to have a lot more power than those who are going to be receiving the resources. So it's important to try and look to support groups that have the kind of leadership that comes from the ground up, rather than speaking, speaking on behalf of communities or on behalf of women. And for me, I think another approach that's really important is to understand that change happens through a range of methods, and to support groups that are working at the grassroots as well as at the advocacy level, as well as at the policy level, and who are innovating new ways of being in our communities that are led by women. So supporting a whole range of initiatives and strategies for change, I think is also very important to make sure that you're making a contribution that goes far.
Thanks, Juniper. And we have Wariri back. So we were just getting into what is feminist grant making. If you want to kind of pick up where you left off, Wariri, that'd be great. Thanks, Juniper.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure exactly where I left off. Yes.
Maybe start from the beginning. It was quite short what we heard.
Okay. So let me start from the beginning. Apologies, but I was saying a critical element for us at the Equality Fund is supporting self-determination. That means really taking direction from organizations led by the people they represent. We do this in supporting young women-led organization, Indigenous-led rights group, LBT-led right groups, and disability-led groups as well. And the critical element here is really understanding that they're expected of their realities and that we trust and respect their solutions. Within that perspective, having that intersectional approach is critical. I won't dive into much as I know that you've recently had a session on this, but it's basically having a rights-based approach to the work, having a critical anti-racist and oppression perspective. The feminist movements globally have been thinking and saying, you've probably heard nothing about us without us, which means, you know, when we're talking about climate justice, we're going to include the rights of indigenous land rights activists in Honduras. We are going to include the rights of Afro-Colombian rural women farmers in Colombia. So that intersectional perspective is really about addressing those power relations. And of course, having flexible funding. We all understand here the underlying issue of organizations working under precarious budgets that are not predictable. So having that core funding, supporting personnel costs as well as organizational strategies and priorities is a critical element, but also having tools that are accessible. That means having application formats that are simple, understanding that there's different literacy levels, understanding that there's emerging context and that things are constantly evolving and changing with different political climates. So being able to be responsive and having that multi-year funding, it really supports organizations from the ground up, as Juniper was saying, to be able to predict and plan their work efficiently. Next slide, please. Something that we are trying to be really intentional about is feminist movement building and supporting women's rights organizations to build the connective tissue and that fiber that sustains their collective actions. There's a lot of project funding that doesn't support organizations towards that transformative change because they're not able to have funding for convenings and gatherings and consortiums across issues and regions. So that's something that we do quite a lot at the Equality Fund as part of our feminist grant making. We know that as funders here that it's always beyond the grant making. We call this grant making plus. Yes, there is the important transactional aspect of providing resources directly to the hands of women and LBT rights organizations. However, the bulk of our work is that accompaniment that we do through our different strategies. So we've sent the money, but the organization still needs support in terms of that strengthening the organizational capacities. We have that broker role where we connect them to other feminist funders or other folks in our ecosystem. We nominate them for awards. We profile them in our strategic communications. And if you happen to be working with women human rights defenders where their lives are often at threat and at risk, having the capacity to respond swiftly and refer them to experts that are doing emergency response plans is critical for their existence and for their survival. And the big piece here in terms of shifting the power, as Mai said in the beautiful introduction, is that we know that there are inherent power imbalances in our world. And in the act of giving and receiving, we acknowledge that there's different social, racial, and economic power balances that give some folks more privileges and some folks more disadvantages and are more oppressed than others. So within that patriarchal context, as feminist grant makers, we acknowledge these tensions and how they show up in our grant-making practices, and we intentionally try to build more equal relationships. We do this in valuing lived experiences. We do this in having feminist learning monitoring approaches that are from the ground up, that have a participatory element, and that decolonize the way we think about learning and evaluation, and that basically empower the folks with who they work with to identify what is important to them. How would they like to learn about this? And how would they like to track it?
This is great.
So,
Go ahead, Ruth.
No, that is all. Thank you. There's plenty to always talk about, but I realize that I've been taking a lot of space. So please go ahead.
Well, it's a great way to set the context to hear both of you talk about the principles of feminist grant making. And then there was a great comment from Emma here about what are concrete suggestions for implementing feminist policies into our organization beyond simply considering gender in grant making. So this is a really great question, right? Because our federal government a few years ago declared themselves as a feminist a feminist government. And so that's a really good question about what is the difference between applying a gender lens to grants versus feminist grant making. So I'll open it up to both Warrior and Juniper, whoever wants to take that question.
I don't think that we need to worry too much about those terms, but I think that it was Emma really put her finger on something, which is about walking the talk, which is that continual like learning process and humility and transforming our organizations inside, not just funding women or feminist or gender equity work outside. So I think that is one of the key principles for both, whether you use gender lens or feminist. For me anyway, doesn't need to be that much of a distinction, but the having an awareness of power and privilege inside of the organization, doing ongoing learning and training so that it's not just a one-time thing and you can check that box off in terms of learning about GBA plus or anti-oppression or whatever, that we've got that done. It's ongoing, and then I think the looking at the internal culture of the organization. We live in a dominant culture which is hierarchical and individualistic and competitive, and even within nonprofits we know that those things can cause a lot of challenges, and so we want to challenge ourselves to do better in our organizations as well, making sure that the work we do is accessible in terms of language or physical spaces or our events. Are we using plain language? Who do we hire? Who is in decision-making power? Ensuring that there's, not just women, but diverse women, women of color, queer women, non-binary people in our networks, and then in our organization, and then in our decision-making processes. So I think that those are some ways, Emma, to address, to bring feminism in to the organization. And then after that, your outside strategies, your grant making are going to be infused with that spirit.
Maria, did you want to add?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Juniper's answer. It's really more about the how, because gender lens means different things for different people. From my experience, sometimes it's just adding more women or more women beneficiaries to a program, an organization that's already running something. So it's really using a crude binary measure of how many women versus how many men. So in that sense, it wouldn't necessarily capture, you know, the intersectional and the political value of feminist grantmaking. However, there's a lot of people that have a way more sophisticated gender lens perspective that starts with that intersectional approach and that looks at inequalities and challenges the status quo. And that also has similar approaches to what others may identify as feminist grantmaking. So I similarly to Juniper, it's really, the semantics in our world is complex, but I would focus on the how more so than the wording.
Great. Can we get into, how about feminist grantmaking in Canada? So what does that look like? I'll pass it to you, Juniper.
Sure. So I got the opportunity last year to work with Philanthropic Foundations of Canada to develop a guide. So it's called, we use the word gender lens. They chose that word, not feminist, but anyway, a guide for foundations around applying a gender lens in their work, including grant making, but not limited to that. Also including investments of the endowment and internal operations and governance, and how to support gender equity work in your community. And so we looked for examples. We were like, where are the foundations that are doing this in Canada? And it was really actually very hard beyond giving to gender equity. So there are quite a number of foundations that, that have gender equity initiatives among their recipients of funds. But anything like deeper, like we were just talking about, kind of walking the talk or applying it to endowments, or it's still very, very young. So you all have an opportunity to be innovators in this space. And I encourage you all, like, even though it seems, you know, daunting, because there's so many potential ways to make this a reality in your organization. You might not know where to start. I would say just start and get to know the networks and go for it. So that was a finding in itself. We were like, it's really hard to find examples of deep feminist grant making focused on Canadian recipients. So we're hoping that with the Equality Fund, with CFC's work, supporting this, and of course the great work of Canadian Women's Foundation, that this is going to expand. We're going to expand the pool for this important work. Some of the things we discovered that folks might not know if you're not in like the gender equity field is that there's been such a lack of resources, especially starting with when the Conservatives were in power for 10 years. They cut a lot of the federal funding to things like shelters and advocacy groups and gender-based analysis and research groups. So a lot, even today, when there's more resources being put into the field again, folks are still kind of reeling from that sense of fear, of scarcity, and it doesn't really, it hampers a lot of work. So just so you know, women's rights employees are paid the least, like women's rights organizations are paid the least among Canadian nonprofits. So this comes from the Making Women Count report that came out a couple of years ago. And many research and advocacy groups focused on gender equity were closed or highly cut back during that period. And we're not out of it yet. So that's my message for funders is, don't assume because we're talking about feminism a lot that these groups are well resourced. They still need increased support, and not only that, feminist organizations are, as this quote says, they're an important democratic tool. So they're channels to bring voices to the surface, to the policy table, to our boardrooms. Like we need them. So we need to support them more. Yeah, so those are some of the things I found. We did a quick survey of PFC members, so I'm not sure if it would be the same for CFC members, but I think we're in this transformational period with the Equality Fund partnership where more of the community foundations are saying like, oh, okay, we can have a role to play. But when we did a quick survey of PFC members, which are basically anyone who's not a community foundation, there were 2/3 of them that had an interest in gender lens philanthropy, but a full third really didn't, because I think that there's still a sense that gender equality has been achieved because we have laws. Look, women can become anything in Canadian society. So there's still a lot of awareness raising that is going on, which Me Too really helped with, but it's ongoing for people to realize how unequal a society we still have on all levels.
Thanks, Juniper. I think I'm going to go back to a comment that Joanne made about ways to identify and remove barriers, and a question to both of you as we're talking about, like feminist grant making and how it's new in Canada. We're still really getting our feet wet in it. So what are some of the challenges that that we might encounter with feminist grant making?
I mean, it's feminist grant making is political work, and it's really taking a clear position on women and LBT rights in different ways, and this could mean supporting issues that might be contentious or that folks don't agree with politically or align with. Let it be as SRHR rights and abortion rights specifically, for example, and having access to that. Let it be supporting sex workers' rights as well. So I think that's one of the challenges in feminist grant making is that political positioning and rooting, and some of the implications depending on the partnerships. If you're working with different governments, if how your donor base reacts to certain strategies or political situations. So it is quite political work, and I think that is challenging in different ways.
What, with all the challenges in place, what can innovation look like? So what does creativity and innovation look like when it comes to feminist grant making? Juniper, do you want to start? Or?
Sure. I would also say I got to be part of the grant review committee at the Foundation of Greater Montreal, where I volunteer. And so we were part of the pilot for the Equality Fund in CFC. And it was really hard. It was really hard. A big challenge was the great need, so the incredible demand for funding that is explicitly feminist or for gender equality. And we struggled with what counts as feminist. Does arts and culture work count as feminist? If the organization doesn't have women in its name, or like isn't a typical women's organization, is more of a community organization, which often groups led by communities of color are more holistic, and they're not just women, but they might be doing an initiative that advances gender equality. So we need to see them, and we need to expand our idea of what counts as feminist work, and not just fund the usual suspects, who are still important and they play a role in the ecosystem, but they're not the only ones, especially as we come to really understand the intersectionality of these issues, and the importance of a diverse strategies to make change. So those were some of the, I think, some innovations that I've seen, not yet in Canada, but I'm really excited about and hope that they happen, would be more cooperative approaches to grant making. So creating, there's some excellent models from the United States that I've seen where in a field, organizations and activists are brought together to make decisions about how a pool of money is used amongst their organization. So, so more collective grant making, so that it supports the networking and the connective tissue, as Wariri said, between the groups, but also compensates them for their time, assures them a certain level of grant, but then they collectively assess where the greatest needs are and where the money should go. So I'm excited about that because it's helping to build the ecosystem, to build the movement, to build the strength, rather than the competitive grant making process, which can be very divisive, especially, as I said, for organizations that have been thirsty for funds for so long and often get overlooked. So I'm excited about that.
Great, Juniper. I'm gonna give Ori the last word before we move into our breakout rooms. So do you want to add anything to creativity and innovation, Ori?
Hi, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes,
okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. Something that we've tried to do is really support testing ideas and supporting experimentation. That means supporting projects that are not in full development and the research aspect of it. And that exploratory aspect has been really transformative for us in thinking about innovation and granting in innovative ways. And again, also using different ways of reporting. We want accessible reporting templates. For example, we've had to have read screener templates for working with disability rights organizations, but we've also used like WhatsApp audio recording as a way of getting relevant but pertinent information for folks which have different literacy levels. So that's been really helpful for us. We recognize that there's different strategies, as Juniper mentioned, and we value extremely different strategies. We've had supporting organizations using boxing as a way of supporting young women's leadership, using radio in the DRC, for example, feminist radio to talk about women, peace, and security issues in South Kivu. So we're really into finding ways of supporting different strategies as well as unlikely collaborations. One of our biggest unlikely collaboration, for example, was working with a sex workers' rights organization in Dakar that was working with the only feminist all-women run law firm, and we're training the sex workers as paralegals. So those are the type of unique opportunities that we want to try and be a part of facilitating that have the potential to unlock new strategies and really different, innovative, and creative way of doing our work.
Okay. So I'm just thinking we've got about 15 minutes left, and so we won't have time to go into our breakout rooms. So I'm going to ask the question to the larger group, and we can just start kind of a conversation. I want you to unmute yourselves if you do want to participate by audio, but you could also just keep doing the chat as well. So the first question is, what are ways that you're already practicing feminist grant making? And then I really wanted for us to take advantage that Wariri and Juniper are here. So what questions do you have? So just listening to what we just heard, what questions do you already have? And then I'm going to actually get into these questions on the slides here. So just starting to think about, as we listened a bit to Juniper and Wariri, what are ways you're already practicing feminist grant making? And are there any questions that are coming up for you? So you can either put your hand up so we can unmute you, and you can do the audio, or you can put it into the chat.
Mai, maybe while folks are putting in their questions or giving it some thought, I just wanted to flag that we saw some really interesting innovation come out of the pilot fund for gender equality through community foundations. So Juniper, your comment about participatory or collective grant making by those who will be beneficiaries. We had a community foundation lead their pilot fund decision making in that manner. So I don't know if anyone from Peterborough is on the call, but we could certainly turn to them for sharing of their experience. So starting to dabble a little bit.
Thanks, Andrea. I think also if we bring up slides 14 and 15, and then we can get Jennifer to share. We can actually show you a little bit about what CFC has been doing around this initiative. And so Andrea, I'll let you share that with the group. And then actually Jennifer, that would be great if you'd like to share what your experience has been.
That's great. Well, when we were going through the pilot fund, which is of course year one of a 5-year journey in which we're very keen to not only think about who we are granting to, but also how we are granting, and also the other internal work that has been mentioned by Juniper and Wariri in terms of really embedding feminist principles into our community foundations, into our work at CFC. And so the next few years of our partnership will certainly allow us to do this, and will actually require it. It isn't just about the actions that we put out into the world, it's about living those values as well. So on the screen here, you can see just a few of the pieces of learning and reflection that came through the pilot fund. In particular, I think that there's a few stats that I find quite interesting. One is that through the experience, the Community Foundation's knowledge and skills in gender lens grant making was increasing. The other is that 56% reported that they were supporting organizations that they hadn't supported in the past. And I think, 56 kind of surprised me, if I'm honest. I thought it might have been a bit higher, but it's a great place to start and gives us opportunity going down the road, and probably speaks to some of that other work that we need to do in terms of encompassing and working across the full community and getting to know those organizations who haven't been our long and standard partners. Maybe just go to the next slide, and then I'll pause for Jennifer's reflections.
So Jennifer, we'll get you to unmute yourself, and happy to hear from you.
And yeah, Cindy, are you able to move to the next slide? Perfect. So again, just a few more reflections and learnings. Needing more opportunities like this for learning. Also really appreciative and looking for more opportunities to have a specific funding stream that's dedicated to gender equality. I think there's also opportunity to consider the ways in which we reflect intersectionality in the broader grant making work that we do. It doesn't just have to be through something that's titled gender equality. So I will pause, and Jennifer, if you're able to weigh in.
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. Wasn't expecting this opportunity, but I'm always happy and excited to share how we approached the Pilot Fund for Gender Equality. When I got Andrea's email that this was a thing, I was so excited. It made my heart sing in a way that I didn't know it could sing. It was great. So I brainstormed a list of people that I thought, organizations in town that are working in this realm, either because of the nature of their work or just how they approach it. And I started meeting with these people one-on-one to tell them about the Pilot Fund and to get them to nominate other people that they thought should be at the table. So it was an interesting process, because in the end I had conversations with 9 different organizations, and they all identified each other. So we had a core group. There were a couple of outliers, but I think we had really tight deadlines. And so we kind of left those, and everybody that had been nominated more than 2 or 3 times was invited, and which was great because it's a small community, but it's easy to do a pilot like that in Peterborough. We're just the right size and everybody knows each other. But they became the group. They were the decision makers. I said, this is how much money we have. Oh, they were guaranteed money. They were guaranteed $2,500 just for showing up, just for saying yes to having a coffee with me, back in the days when you can do that. And And so they were guaranteed money, and I think that made a huge difference in that they were confident coming into the meeting that their input was really valued and was going to be heard. And then we talked about, they brought different ideas to the table, and the cross-pollination of their ideas as we talked was fantastic. It's like, oh no, you don't need to apply for a grant for that. We can offer you this, and we'll help you with that. And it was just fantastic. So by the time the ideas were fully articulated in that first meeting, they all had a really good sense of where they wanted to go. There were a couple of organizations who'd sort of been fighting for many years, who ended up figuring out a project that they could work together on. It was amazing. Then they went away over Christmas holidays, put their applications together. We came back in January, and I said, this is how much money we have available. You guys figure out, you've read each other's applications, figure out how we're going to distribute it. And again, the give and take, saying, oh, I thought I needed this money, but actually your project is so much richer and will advance the cause of women in our community so much further than mine ever will. I really want to put my money there, and I will take less. Like, there was so much of that, and I could give you lots of examples and talk for ages, but so email me if you're interested. But it was a really rewarding experience, and so sad that COVID intervened and we weren't able to have our final wrap up. So the final reports and things have been kind of spotty and coming in. I've heard anecdotal stuff from people, but it was a great start, and it's certainly a lens that we've continued in our own community response fund granting that we've been doing this spring, where we've been bringing people together, and the recipients, they've been guaranteed money coming to the table, and then they're deciding what to do with the proceeds. So we've had over $300,000 in our local community response fund that has been granted in that process. And we're trying again, certainly with convening our grant review panels for the emergency community support fund. We're taking some of those lessons learned into that as much as we can within the constraints of these criteria. So it's been a very rich and rewarding experience, and I can't wait to do more.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. I think there's a lot of learning that we can still do from each other. And so we'd love to hear if anyone else would like to share, we'd love to hear from you. There's some other great examples too that Emma wrote up here about what does feminist grant making look like. So their foundation has been ensuring that they have women, and particularly women of color, on granting committees, targeting communications around opportunities for funding to women-led and women-supporting organizations, trying to make out applications as streamlined as possible, and also providing alternative application processes as needed. And Julie wrote strategies for supporting non-qualified donees, getting grant money to the most grassroots groups. So some great examples. We do have a question from Joanne. Any strategies that help mobilize funds when recipient is not a qualified donee? This is a great question. It came up in our first webinar as well. I'm going to open it up to Wariri and Juniper. Do you have any tips for ways to help mobilize funds when a recipient's not a qualified donee?
For sure. I will share in the chat box if I can find it quickly enough. I believe that Calgary Foundation or United Way Calgary, I think it was in Calgary, that they developed a toolkit to support philanthropic donors specifically around this question. It is possible through creating service agreements or finding an organization that's willing to flow through funds to more grassroots non-incorporated organizations or non-charitable organizations. I think it's something that more and more foundations need to consider and just figure it out. Just if you're very concerned, just invest in hiring a lawyer who knows how to do it and create the templates for the agreements and just go for it. The risks to a foundation are so minimal compared to the risks that a lot of communities are facing right now. And so I think it's incumbent on everybody to stretch beyond our usual comfort zone and explore new practices. But it's definitely possible. There are foundations doing it, and I'll try and find that resource quickly now.
Yeah, we are certainly supporting the unusual suspects, and it's really being intentional in our outreach strategies. We are supporting groups that are not registered. If we cannot support them, we refer them strategically to other folks in our ecosystem that have capacity to support groups. It's also challenging the whole element of risk. Risks is often seen in a very colonial INGO model. But then as a feminist grant makers, I invite us to think about what is risk and how can we frame it from a feminist perspective. As our partners are just literally risking their lives on the front lines every day, how could we leverage risk, and how can we have tools that embody and already strategize for including risk in the strategies that we have in our grant making processes.
Thank you, Uri. We're going to go to our next slide. We've got a few more minutes, and I want to touch very quickly upon tools and resources. Here are a few examples. I'm wondering, Juniper and Uri, do you have any other tools or resources that we could add to this very short list that we have here that we could direct people to help them in their journey of feminist grant making?
Definitely. I mean, international leaders include Mama Cash, and there's a network as well of women's funds. So women's funds around the world have been real leaders in developing this practice, just as the Match International Women Fund was, which transformed into Equality Fund. And they have a lot of fun resources. They've done a lot of thinking about what is feminist fundraising, what is feminist grant making, and so on. So definitely check them out. Another really exciting group to watch internationally is the Frida Young Feminist Fund. So wouldn't it be great to have something like that in Canada? My background is supporting like youth development and young women's empowerment. So definitely making a plug for that. And then we've shared a few things in the chat. So I shared RSF, Social Finance, is a foundation in California that's been doing this model of shared gifting. So we're getting grantees together to determine grant priorities and distribution. They have tons of resources on what they've learned about how to do that well. So I've shared a bunch in the chat.
Great. Well, Riri, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I would add FEMI, which is the International Indigenous Women's Fund, that are also a member of Prospera, which is the International Women's Funding Network that Juniper was referring to. I would also add Global Fund for Women that have been talking about this for some time, and we were in partnership with them as well when we were the Match International Fund before the transition. And I would add the African Women's Development Fund, who have an African and a Black feminist charter of what feminist grant making looks like from an African perspective, but also with an Indigenous and a racial lens to it. Yeah.
Mai, maybe just one more. There's a report that seems to come out annually or every other year. You might know more about the best and worst place to be a woman in Canada. That is put out through the Policy Alternatives Center, I believe. And that's a really illuminating report in terms of the experience of women across Canada. And I know it has helped several foundations to better understand the importance of supporting this type of work.
Great, thank you so much. So we are right now at our hour. We're going to put up the slide on the questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I would like to thank our speakers today, Wariri and Juniper and Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Hopefully we've given you at least a little bit of a taste and a foundation of the principles of feminist grant making and expose you to some of the awareness around the resources and tools. Thank you so much for joining the webinar, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I mentioned this is a two-part series, and by no means the end of this series as we continue to explore this topic and go deeper in our work. So stay tuned for more opportunities coming out later this fall and through the winter. So to our presenters, thank you for joining us today and taking the time. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise. And to everyone, have a great day.
Bye.